Welcome to Headline Buster, brought to you by The Point. I'm Li Qiuyuan, sitting in for Liu Xin. In this series, I dissect stories that are making headlines around the world and talk to my guests to compensate for the missing pieces of the puzzle. So join us in real time by sending us your comments or questions via the CGTN page on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, or Weibo. If you're watching this live on the CGTN app, email us at thepointwithlx@cgtn.com. Let me know what you think. We bring the Headline Buster on Fridays, so do get in touch and we might just read out your comments. So, on August 19th, 1919, Afghanistan celebrated its independence from British rule. And yesterday, 102 years later, the victorious Taliban said they were also celebrating the result of their jihadist resistance that, quote, forced another arrogant world power, the United States, to fail and retreat from our holy territory. Now, after 2 decades of American invasion and occupation, the Islamic fighters strode into the empty presidential palace in Kabul on August 15th, within days of United States troops pulling out, live-streamed their entry and held their first international press conference. Is that the only shock? Well, no. Perhaps an equal shock is how the media is reporting all of this. In a rarest of rare scene, the tone has been uniform across latitudes and longitudes from North Pole to South Pole. Headlines everywhere are calling it an abject failure of America's leadership, foreign policy, and intelligence. And surprise, surprise, from China and the Communist Party of China, which used to be the pet hates of the Western media, overnight U.S. President Joe Biden has become the greatest villain, the new Dark Knight. So how did things come to this unimaginable pass for the United States, the leader of the free world since the Second World War? Well, here's the timeline of key events that led to the Afghanistan debacle. In 2001, President George W. Bush began U.S. war on terror in retaliation to the September 11th attacks that killed around 3,000 Americans on American soil. Airstrikes pounded Afghanistan from October, and in December, the ruling Taliban fled Kabul. From 2004 to 2009, 2 rounds of elections were held, but Afghanistan remained turbulent. Taliban regrouped and started guerrilla counterattacks. Now, U.S. sent more troops, and on May 2nd, 2011, the September 11th, Osama bin Laden was killed in U.S. operations in Pakistan. Now, U.S. eventually began to withdraw troops from Afghanistan, and in 2014, NATO ended combat mission there in Afghanistan. In February 2020, U.S. signed a deal with Taliban agreeing to leave if they ceasefire and started power-sharing talks with the Afghan government. But violence continued. And in July 2021, U.S. left Bagram Air Base, center of its operations in Afghanistan. Taliban started advancing, taking over towns and provinces in shocking speed. And on August 15th, Taliban reached Kabul. President Ashraf Ghani fled the country. So, what is going to happen next? The U.S. media is now reflecting on its government's Afghanistan policy. There's also a lot of soul-searching in the U.K. and the EU. Now, Joe Biden's approval rating in the U.S. has hit its lowest level. A Reuters Ipsos public opinion poll on August 16th found only 46% of respondents approved of his performance in office, down from 53% after nearly $1 trillion of U.S. taxpayers' money and thousands of American lives were wasted in Afghanistan. Now, Biden addressed the nation on August 16th, defending the pullout. Have a listen.
American troops cannot and should not be fighting in a war and dying in a war that Afghan forces are not willing to fight for themselves.
There you had it, but has not appeased the rising criticism. A CNN report on August 16th, for example, states what many are thinking. It says Biden's mismanagement of the withdrawal from Afghanistan underscored his core point that U.S. visions of forging a functioning nation were illusory and that many more years of U.S. involvement would not make any difference. While there is anger at the failure of Western intelligence that did not foresee the pullout would lead to immediate chaos. And here's what former British Prime Minister Theresa May said in Parliament.
Was our understanding of the Afghan government so weak? Was our knowledge of the position on the ground so inadequate? Or did we really believe this? Or did we just feel that we had to follow the United States and hope that on a wing and a prayer it would be all right on the night?
The Taliban are well aware of the fears of retaliation against many army men and Americans, and especially about the situation of women. In their first press conference on August 17th, they stated their position, saying this. Have a listen.
We are bound by the rights of women that have been given by Sharia. Our sisters and mothers will be given all the rights that God has given them. Women are a part of society. Women will work in various fields of the country while living under Sharia. Women will work in education, health, and other fields, and will play an active role. We want a future government and system that includes people of all schools of thought. We don't want more war. We want peace in Afghanistan. I must remind you that we forgive everyone because it is in the interest of peace and stability in Afghanistan. All the groups that were confronting us are all forgiven.
And after these concerns, it's time to bring out the China card. Yes, China still remains in media crosshairs despite other preoccupations. And there's rife speculation about Beijing's future role in the region. Will it step into the United States' shoes? Is it setting itself up for a similar fall? The negative spin grew when China decided to talk to the Taliban, of course. For a section of the media, the issue is not someone trying to restore peace after the U.S. abandoned its responsibilities, but that in doing so, they could gain greater influence than the U.S. and greater access to Afghanistan's mineral and other resources. At a recent presser in Beijing, Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson Hua Chunying made China's position clear. Have a listen.
China has all along respected Afghanistan's sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity, adhered to non-interference in Afghanistan's internal affairs, and pursued a friendly policy toward the entire Afghan people. China respects the Afghan people's right to decide on their own future independently. We're ready to continue to develop good neighborliness and friendly cooperation with Afghanistan and play a constructive role in Afghanistan's peace and reconstruction.
In fact, even the United States has officially said it hopes China will play an important role. A day after the Taliban takeover, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken spoke with Chinese State Councilor and Foreign Minister Wang over the phone, noting that the current situation in Afghanistan is entering a crucial stage. Now, the Taliban should announce a clean break with extremism, opt for an orderly transfer of power, and establish an inclusive government. He also hoped China would play an important role to this end. Now, the present is uncertain in Afghanistan. The United Nations World Food Program warned this month that 14 million Afghans face acute food scarcity in a country of around 39 million. Thousands are living in the streets, and thousands more are scrambling to exit the country any way they can. And in such a situation, what's the role of a responsible media? Well, let's now take a break. While we pause on that, we'll be back with the experts to tell you more about this. Do stay with us. Welcome back to Headline Buster, brought to you by The Point. A lot to unpack about the situation there in Afghanistan, and I'm now joined by an awesome panel. There are Mr. Mosharraf Zaidi joining us in Islamabad from Pakistan. He's a strategic affairs expert from Tabadlab. Thank you for joining us. And also Professor Wang Jiangyu joining us from Hong Kong. He's a professor from the School of Law at City University in Hong Kong. And also Professor Josef Mahoney joining us from Memphis, Tennessee. He's from the East China Normal University. Great to have all of you with us. So let's talk about this. What a dramatic week we have just witnessed. I mean, a lot of people are still digesting what just happened to the country. Let me start with Mr. Zaidi first. What do you think?
Well, thanks for having me. I think that the question of legitimacy will really depend a lot on the decisions that are made in Beijing, in Moscow, and in Islamabad as far as accepting the kind of unilateral decision of the Taliban to declare the emirate without necessarily taking into account the input or the political position of other Afghan groups. One of the things that I know China and Russia and indeed the US and other countries have insisted on is that whatever happens after the fall of Kabul has to be inclusive so that we don't see a return to the Afghanistan of the late 90s when the Taliban first took over, when there was a lot of brutality, a lot of unilateral decision-making about the system of governance, and how dissent would be treated, how Afghanistan would essentially be cut off from the rest of the world. If the Taliban choose to continue making unilateral decisions, then it's likely that the acceptance that they seek from the rest of the world, particularly from countries like China and Russia, I don't think will be forthcoming.
Yeah, it is a complicated matter. A lot of countries have responded to the latest situation in very cautious manner. So, Mr. Zaidi, what's Pakistan's stance on this? Will Pakistan eventually recognize the Taliban-led government's legitimacy?
Pakistan is stuck in a really difficult position. I think that the compulsion on Pakistan is sort of twinned. You have obviously the need to ensure that Afghanistan is not in a state of chaos or in a state of civil war, where terrorist groups can regroup, organize, plan, and attack Pakistani cities, Pakistani villages, Pakistani soldiers, and Pakistani citizens. And as you know, as your viewers would remember, Pakistan has been through a long period of terrorist attacks from 2007 to 2014. Essentially, terrorists were overrunning many parts of the country in terms of being able to freely attack and get away with those attacks. The Pakistan Army fought back from 2014 onwards, and peace and stability in the country was restored. But this is a very tenuous and tentative peace. And any time that terrorists have the freedom to mobilize and reorganize, they will. And so the risk in Afghanistan of an unstable Afghanistan is the emanation of new terrorist threats or old terrorist threats from Afghanistan. In that regard, Pakistan would seek to recognize and work with whoever is in power in Kabul, and right now that happens to be the Taliban. But concurrently, Pakistan is also extremely sensitive to the concerns of other countries, whether it is China or the United States, about whether or not the relationship with the Taliban, the Pakistani government and its relationship with the Taliban, whether or not that comes at the cost of the ability of Islamabad to control not just its own borders, but also to convince the Taliban to make sure that it shuts down those kinds of groups, because they don't just represent a threat to Pakistan, they also represent a threat to countries like China, countries like the US. I think the one positive, the one sort of ray of optimism that we can all look at and consider and hope brings some fruit to bear is the fact that Afghanistan might be the one global issue on which the US and China, on which Pakistan and Russia, on which Iran and Saudi Arabia, all these countries have a converging interest. And so as long as spoilers in Afghanistan can be kept at bay, and Pakistan works closely with China, with the Russians, with the Americans, I think there's some hope that the Taliban will feel enough pressure to behave in a way that's consistent with global norms.
Right. And another issue that's capturing global attention is, of course, women's rights there. Now, the group, Taliban, has vowed to respect women's rights there, despite the history of oppression. Professor Wang, do you think the Taliban will fulfill its promise?
It's quite interesting that the Taliban this time, unlike its position 20 years ago, it's in the process of striking a different tune, a more moderate tune. It has said that it has pledged to protect the rights of women within the limits of Islamic law, and it has issued, at least announced, amnesty to those government, to those officials and soldiers and employees who worked for the former government. So it seems to me that the Taliban has learned the lesson, so they want to be more rational. They want to rationalize eventually their control of the whole country. But what we have heard are mere words, are gestures. So we will see what would happen if Taliban is in control, is in power, is in control of the whole country, whether its actual policy will be as moderate as it has just announced. in this regard, I think US, China, Russia, and the international community share a common vision, a common interest to make sure human rights, especially women's rights, are protected. And apart from the Chinese top priority of anti-terrorism.
Professor Mahoney, let me bring you into this. Your thoughts on this? Do you agree with what's been said there?
I do, but I think that, I think that there's this expectation or this standard, sort of this liberal Western universal standard of a certain notion of feminism, which I'm not personally opposed to as a Marxist feminist myself, but nevertheless, I think that sort of standard may end up being something that it may be unreasonable to expect a Taliban government to live up to. Would we expect a Taliban-led government to be more progressive than say the government in Riyadh or in other Islamic countries? It's hard to say.
And Professor Mahoney, another question for you. There seems to be a global consensus that the U.S. has lost its leadership role in the region there. There are reports that President Joe Biden, he hadn't spoke with any world leaders until Thursday this week. And Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau had to spoke with former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton is dead. Do you think that the U.S. is now losing its driving role that in the region on critical issues as, for example, issues on Iran, as the U.S. is now pushing for tougher sanctions?
Well, this is not a new development, but there are several sides to the story. First, we should recall that the U.S. has often resorted to superpower politics and acted unilaterally, strong-arming even allies into Washington-led policies that have proved catastrophic for most involved, and done so for decades, certainly throughout the Cold War and the War on Terror. And second, Trump also acted unilaterally, but his incredible missteps on COVID, his unnecessary trade wars, his actions in the Middle East and East Asia, always in the context of America first, disrupted relations globally and alienated many countries close to the U.S. And third, with Biden, many American allies were so relieved that Trump was defeated that they, more or less unrealistically embraced St. Joe as a return to normalcy, particularly Europeans who were excited that his foreign policy team specialized in European and Russian affairs, that the U.S. would return to the Paris Agreement, the World Health Organization, perhaps pivot towards Russia, sort out the Iran conflict, and so on. But almost predictably, Biden has disappointed for three reasons. First, he's a weak president. He's leading a divided country, still struggling to contain and recover from COVID, still facing significant economic problems given its debt, interest rates, inflation, still recovering from 4 years of Trump chaos and so on. Of course, it was already a country in significant decline before COVID. Politically, he has very little room to maneuver with thin margins in Congress and an uncertain picture for the midterm elections. Second, this has meant in part that he hasn't had the ability to fundamentally alter some of Trump's foreign policies without distracting from his domestic agenda. And in the case of Afghanistan, arguably it was already too late to do so. And third, Biden is not some new age, go easy, let there be global equality politician, particularly in foreign policy where a U.S. president's power is greatest. So like his predecessors who also enjoyed flexing, we shouldn't be surprised to see Biden doing the same. In fact, I don't think Biden cares much about North Korea or Iran. I don't think he cares much about Afghanistan, given what we've seen. I don't even think he's particularly concerned about climate change, gun violence, or race relations. This is going to be difficult for many in Europe and elsewhere to accept and even acknowledge, especially those counting on Washington leadership and those without independent foreign policy. What Biden does care about are his signature domestic policy efforts, the infrastructure bill, in tandem with domestic COVID containment and recovery, and at least looking like he's standing strong against China. These are the three fundamental issues that will shape whether his party keeps power in Congress and whether he's reelected 3 years from now.
Those are some interesting points you've raised there. Now, I'm getting words from my producer that we are having some comments from the viewers who are watching us online, so let me just read some to you. This is from Goober Walla. He's joining us, or she's joining us on YouTube. He said this: Washington is making another grave policy choice to freeze the assets of Afghan people. Also from YouTube, Delight Loves Movies says, after World War II, the USA launched a series of wars like the Korean, the Vietnam, the Iraq, and the Afghanistan wars. What do you think those wars have brought to these countries? Let me put that question to Mr. Zaidi. What do you think? How do you see the situation there transpire, especially for the United States?
You know, there's been a lot of talk, and I think Professor Mahoney just dealt with it really, really well. This talk of American decline as a result of failure in Afghanistan, I think, is a little bit premature. Not so much because there's something virtuous about these interventions, but because the fact that the United States can engage in these kinds of interventions and then exit them in largely failure has not impeded the next time that the U.S. has done that. You know, Korea in the 50s, Vietnam in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, the Gulf War in the 90s, everything after 9/11. In each case, the aftermath of U.S. intervention was destruction. And some countries were very lucky to have been in the kinds of neighborhoods where they were able to recover. I think Vietnam is a good example of that. But if we look at the state of Iraq, the state of Syria, the state of Libya today, and the prospects for those countries, it's not good. If anything, not only have those countries collapsed, but the countries around them face insufferable levels of instability and challenges to whether or not they can be what I referred to earlier as countries that align with global norms. I think increasingly the dependence of the big powers on the planet. I'm not sure we still have a world in which the US is the sole superpower, but we do have multiple powers. And among those powers, I think that there's an increasing, or there should be an increasing pressure in Beijing, in Moscow, and in Washington, D.C. to ensure that it's whatever the immediate impact of the withdrawal is on Afghanistan, that it doesn't cause a knock-on instability in countries like Pakistan, Iran, and the Central Asian states. So I think the interests of the global community are not restricted to just tracking what happens in Afghanistan. I think bad things are likely to happen in Afghanistan. But the real challenge is to prevent a spillover of that instability into the surrounding countries and the wider region.
Right. Professor Wang, I got to give you a chance to respond to what's been said there. How is Beijing seeing all of this? Because some are pointing out that Beijing might be keen to fill that power vacuum left in the region. What's in Beijing's best interest?
The most beautiful part of the Chinese foreign policy approach is non-interference. So China probably doesn't have much to gain from the U.S. loss of war there, but China has nothing to lose there, because the China's top priority is anti-terrorism, to make sure that Afghanistan does not become kind of a training ground and a shelter for terrorists. And once the Afghanistan has an effective and stable government, then whoever is in power, China will work with that government to make sure Afghanistan does not become a base for terrorists, which threatens China's security. And China's second interest, the second priority is China wants to have a stable neighbor, right? And stable neighbor which focus on economic development, in which China can play a very constructive and a very important role. So China can do trade and investment with that country. China can promote its Belt and Road Initiative and can build the infrastructure there. So that's secondary to the first priority, which is anti-terrorism.
You mentioned the Belt and Road Initiative, terrorist problem, security situation, China wanting a stable neighbor. I gotta have Professor Mahoney joining us on this question, because I understand you have something to share with us, because some are assuming that now with Afghanistan under Taliban's control, the terrorists there could use Afghanistan's soil to incite violence in China's Xinjiang, and there are also threats to China's Belt and Road Initiative there in the region. How are you seeing this?
Well, I suspect the real question is whether the new government is able to formulate an effective, relatively uniform national policy, or whether different parts of the country will remain factionalized or tribalized. Now, if more uniform and centralized, then perhaps we won't see much opportunity for this type of threat to gain significant operational capacity. And I think it's fairly clear that in terms of foreign policy, the new national government wants to avoid being a staging ground against other countries. It wants to avoid inviting that kind of conflict and potential invasion again. But, if such a firm leadership is unable to exercise control nationally, which, is still a real possibility, then there might be opportunities for anti-China groups to entrench themselves and create trouble for Beijing. But even if that happens, I don't think we'll see anything reaching the same level as before, something on the same level as Al-Qaeda being able to stage attacks like we saw on 9/11, in part because, as Mr. Zaidi said, everyone will be watching more carefully. And secondly, China in particular has many means for addressing these kinds of problems, as it's already done in other places, including Pakistan.
Well said. We're going to have to leave it there. Thank you very much. Great discussion. Professor Joseph Gregory Mahoney joining us from Memphis, Tennessee. Professor Wang Jiangyu joining us from Hong Kong. And also Mr. Mosharraf Zaidi joining us from Islamabad, Pakistan. Thank you so much for taking the time talking to us. And that's going to do it for this edition of Headline Buster, brought to you by The Point. Thank you so much for your company. Have a good one.